The summer of 1886 had been merciless to Tombstone, Arizona. The sun beat down like a blacksmith's hammer on the dusty streets, and even the saloons seemed to wilt under the oppressive heat. Eli Mercer rode into town just as the church bells chimed 9 o'clock, their bronze voices echoing off the adobe walls and wooden storefronts that lined Allen Street. "Hi, how are you? Sorry to interrupt your story, but what I'm going to ask you is really quick, and it will really help the channel to grow and create new stories. Just click below the video image to subscribe. You'll be doing an act of kindness and encouragement to those who are just starting out. Thank you very much, and continue with your story." Eli was a man who carried his 43 years like old leather, weathered, scarred, but still strong. His gray eyes held the distant look of someone who had seen too much, and the Colt, 45 on his hip, suggested he'd done more than just watch. The townspeople called him the Lonesome Rider, though never to his face. He preferred it that way. "Evening, stranger," called Martha Bell from the doorway of her boarding house, the Copper Queen Inn. She was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands. "You look like you could use a hot meal and a clean bed." Eli tipped his hat. "Much obliged, ma'am. Just passing through." "They all say that," Martha smiled. "But Tombstone has a way of keeping folks longer than they planned." As Eli dismounted his horse, a chestnut mare named Dusty, Sheriff Frank Mallory emerged from the jailhouse across the street. Mallory was a tall man with a perfectly waxed mustache and a badge that gleamed despite the dust that covered everything else in town. His smile was practiced, the kind politicians wore. "Welcome to Tombstone, friend," Mallory said, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "I'm Sheriff Mallory. Keeping the peace in these parts." "Eli Mercer," came the simple reply. "Won't be any trouble." "I'm sure you won't be." Mallory's smile never wavered, but his eyes were calculating. "What brings you to our fair town?" "Just riding through." The sheriff studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. "Well, enjoy your stay, Mr. Mercer. And remember, we run a clean town here. Real clean." That night, Eli sat in Martha's dining room, working his way through a plate of beef stew and cornbread. The other guests, a traveling salesman, a mining engineer, and a preacher, chatted quietly about silver prices and the weather. It was the kind of peaceful evening Eli had been seeking for months. Then the screams shattered the night. It was high-pitched, desperate, the cry of a child in mortal terror. Eli was on his feet before the echo faded, his chair clattering to the floor. Through the window, he could see people emerging from buildings, looking around in confusion. "What in the Lord's name?" Martha began. Another scream, fainter now, coming from the direction of the hills east of town. Without a word, Eli grabbed his hat and headed for the door. "Mr. Mercer, where are you going?" Martha called after him. "Someone's in trouble." The night air was cool against his face as Eli saddled Dusty and rode hard toward the sound. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the rocky terrain dotted with saguaro cacti and scrub brush. He followed a narrow trail that wound up into the foothills, his ears straining for any sound. Then he heard it, not a scream this time, but sobbing. Quiet, heartbroken sobbing that seemed to come from the earth itself. Eli dismounted and followed the sound on foot, his boots crunching softly on the gravelly soil. The crying led him to a dark opening in the hillside, a cave mouth partially hidden by a fallen boulder. The smell hit him first, the musky, wild scent of bear. "Hello?" he called softly. "Anyone in there?" The sobbing stopped abruptly. "I'm not going to hurt you," Eli said, his voice gentle. "My name's Eli. I heard you crying." A small voice, trembling with fear, came from the darkness. Are you one of them?" "One of who, son?" "The men. The bad men." Eli's jaw tightened. "No, boy. I'm not one of the bad men. Can you come out here where I can see you?" There was a long pause, then the sound of small feet shuffling across stone. A figure emerged from the cave, a boy maybe 10 years old, with sandy hair and clothes torn and dirty. His face was streaked with tears and dirt, and his eyes held a terror no child should ever know. "What's your name, son?" Eli asked, crouching down to the boy's level. "Jacob," the boy whispered. "Jacob Turner." "Well, Jacob Turner, you're safe now. Can you tell me what happened? How did you end up in a bear cave?" Jacob's lower lip trembled. "I was running. They took my family. My ma and pa and little sister, Sarah. They said they'd come back for me, but I ran. I ran and ran until I found this place." Eli felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. "Who took your family, Jacob?" "Bad men. Men with guns and they had badges." The words hit Eli like a physical blow. "Badges? You mean lawmen?" Jacob nodded frantically. "But they weren't real lawmen. Pa said so before they... The boy couldn't finish the sentence. Eli placed a gentle hand on Jacob's shoulder. "It's okay, son. You don't have to say it right now. But I need you to listen to me very carefully. Can you do that?" Jacob nodded. "We need to get you somewhere safe, and then you need to tell me everything you remember. Every detail, no matter how small. Can you do that for me? You believe me?" Jacob's eyes were wide with hope and disbelief. "I believe you, son, and I'm going to help you." As they made their way back down the hill, Jacob riding behind Eli on Dusty, the boy's voice was barely audible over the night wind. "Mr. Eli?" "Yes, son? There's something else. Something I heard them talking about." "What's that?" "They said something about a secret. Something buried under the town. And they said..." Jacob's voice dropped to a whisper. "They said don't trust the law." Eli's blood ran cold. In his years as a soldier and a drifter, he'd seen corruption and evil in many forms. But the idea that it had taken root here, in this dusty frontier town, and that it involved the murder of innocent families. "Jacob," he said quietly, "I want you to promise me something." "What?" "Don't tell anyone else what you just told me. Not yet. Not until we figure out who we can trust." As they rode back toward Tombstone, its lights twinkling in the distance like fallen stars, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The boy's story had opened a door to something dark and twisted, something that went to the very heart of the town. And somewhere in the shadows, he was certain, the men with badges were already planning their next move. The peaceful evening Eli had been enjoying seemed like a lifetime ago. Now, with Jacob's small arms wrapped around his waist and the boy's terrible secret burning in his mind, Eli Mercer knew his days of riding alone were over. The question was, in a town where the law itself might be corrupt, who could they trust? And more importantly, how many more families would die before the truth came to light? Dawn came slowly to Tombstone, painting the eastern sky in shades of amber and rose. Eli had spent the night in Martha's boarding house, with young Jacob sleeping fitfully in the room next door. The boy had awakened twice, screaming from nightmares, and each time Eli had been there to calm him down. Now, as the town began to stir, Eli sat by the window watching the street below. Sheriff Mallory was making his morning rounds, stopping to chat with shopkeepers and tipping his hat to the ladies. To anyone watching, he looked like the picture of a dedicated lawman. But Jacob's words echoed in Eli's mind. "Don't trust the law." A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Mercer?" It was Martha's voice. "Breakfast is ready downstairs." "Much obliged, Mrs. Bell. We'll be right down." Jacob was already awake, sitting on the edge of his bed and staring at his hands. The morning light revealed the full extent of his ordeal. Scratches on his arms, bruises on his face, and clothes that looked like they'd been torn by thorns and rocks during his desperate flight. "How are you feeling, son?" Eli asked. "Scared," Jacob admitted. "What if they find me?" "They won't. I won't let them." Eli's voice carried a conviction that seemed to comfort the boy. "But I need you to be brave a little longer. We're going to go downstairs and have breakfast, and you're going to act like everything's normal. Can you do that?" Jacob nodded, though his hands were trembling. The dining room was busy with the morning crowd. The traveling salesman was reading a newspaper, the mining engineer was studying maps, and the preacher was quietly saying grace over his eggs and bacon. Martha bustled about, refilling coffee cups and making sure everyone had enough to eat. "Well, good morning," she said cheerfully when she saw Eli and Jacob. "And who might this young man be?" "This is Jacob," Eli said carefully. "He's my nephew. His folks sent him to spend some time with me." Martha's eyes softened as she looked at Jacob's battered appearance. "Oh, you poor dear. What happened to you?" "Took a tumble off his horse yesterday," Eli said quickly. "Boys that age, they think they're invincible." "Well, you just sit right here, sweetheart," Martha said, pulling out a chair for Jacob. "I'll get you some nice hot pancakes and bacon. That'll fix you right up." As they ate, Eli noticed Sheriff Mallory through the window, talking to a group of men near the jailhouse. One of them was a tall, lean man with a black hat and a cruel smile, someone Eli didn't recognize. The way they kept glancing toward the boarding house made his skin crawl. "Mrs. Bell," Eli said quietly. "That man talking to the sheriff, the one in the black hat. You know him?" Martha followed his gaze, and her expression darkened slightly. "That's Hank Drury. Well, he claims to be a cattle buyer, but folks around here have their suspicions." "What kind of suspicions?" "The kind you don't talk about in polite company," Martha said, lowering her voice. "Cattle that go missing, families that pack up and leave town sudden-like. Nothing you can prove, mind you, but—" She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Eli felt Jacob tense beside him. After breakfast, Eli took Jacob for a walk around town, ostensibly to show him the sights, but really to get a feel for the place and its people. They visited the general store, where the proprietor, a nervous man named Wilkins, kept glancing at the door as if expecting trouble. They stopped by the church, where Reverend Hayes welcomed them warmly but seemed distracted. "Terrible thing about the Turner family," the Reverend said, shaking his head sadly. Eli's blood froze. "The Turner family? Oh, you wouldn't know, being new in town. They had a homestead about 10 miles north of here. Whole family just up and disappeared 3 days ago. House was burned to the ground. Sheriff thinks it might have been Apache raiders, but—" He lowered his voice. "Between you and me, there hasn't been Apache trouble in these parts for years." Jacob's hand found Eli's, gripping it tightly. The boy was fighting back tears, but he didn't say a word. "That's terrible," Eli managed. "Any survivors?" "None that we know of, though there was talk of a boy, the youngest son. But if he was there when it happened—" The Reverend shook his head again. "Well, let's just pray for their souls." As they left the church, Jacob finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "They burned our house?" "I'm sorry, son. I'm so sorry." "Ma's garden? Sarah's dolls? Everything?" Eli knelt down and put his hands on Jacob's shoulders. "Listen to me, Jacob. Things can be replaced. People can't. Your family, they wouldn't want you to give up. They'd want you to be strong, to survive, to make sure the truth comes out. But how? Who's going to believe a kid? I believe you, and we're going to find others who will too." That afternoon, while Jacob rested at the boarding house, Eli made his way to the Silver Dollar Saloon. It was the kind of place where men talked freely after a few drinks, and information flowed as freely as the whiskey. The bartender, a grizzled man named Pete, served him a shot of rye whiskey and leaned against the bar. "You're the fellow staying at Martha's place, right? The one with the boy?" "That's right. Cute kid. Reminds me of the Turner boy. Poor little Jacob. Terrible shame what happened to that family." Eli kept his expression neutral. "So I heard. Any idea what really happened out there?" Pete glanced around the saloon, then leaned closer. "You didn't hear this from me, but there's been talk. The Turner place wasn't just a homestead. Old man Turner found something out there, something valuable. Some say it was silver, others say it was something else entirely." "Something else?" "Documents. Papers. The kind that could ruin certain people if they came to light." Before Eli could ask more questions, the saloon doors swung open and Sheriff Mallory walked in, followed by Hank Drury and 2 other men. The conversation in the room died instantly. "Afternoon, Pete," Mallory said, his voice friendly but his eyes cold. "Heard we had a new face in town." "Sheriff?" Eli nodded. "Mr. Mercer, isn't it? How are you finding our little town?" "Peaceful enough. That's what we like to hear." Mallory's smile was sharp as a knife. "Though I understand you've taken on some family responsibilities. A nephew, I believe?" Eli's hand moved instinctively closer to his gun. "That's right. Funny thing, Drury spoke for the first time, his voice like gravel. I could have sworn I saw that boy before, maybe 3, 4 days ago, up north of town. The saloon was dead silent now. Eli could feel every eye on him. Must be mistaken, Eli said calmly. Boy's been traveling with me for weeks. Of course, Mallory said, but his eyes never left Eli's face. Well, enjoy your stay, Mr. Mercer, and give my regards to your nephew. As the lawmen left, Pete wiped down a glass with shaking hands. Mister, he whispered, I don't know what game you're playing, but you'd better be real careful. That boy you're protecting, if he's who I think he is, there are people in this town who would kill to keep him quiet. What do you mean? The Turner family didn't just stumble onto something valuable. They stumbled onto something that connects to some very powerful people. People who've been running this town from the shadows for years. What kind of people? Pete's eyes darted to the door. The kind that wear badges and smile while they're cutting your throat. That evening, as Eli sat with Jacob in their room, the boy finally told him the whole story. How his father had found a cache of documents hidden in an old mine shaft. How those documents revealed a conspiracy involving land fraud, murder, and corruption that reached all the way to the territorial government. How men with badges had come in the night, demanding the papers. Pa tried to fight them, Jacob whispered, but there were too many. They made us watch while they... He couldn't finish. Where are the documents now, Jacob? Pa hid them. Before they came. He made me memorize where, in case something happened. Eli felt a chill run down his spine. Do you remember? Jacob nodded. Under the old church, the one that burned down 5 years ago. Pa said nobody would think to look there. As the night deepened, and the town settled into an uneasy quiet, Eli realized they were sitting on a powder keg. Jacob wasn't just a witness to murder. He was the key to exposing a conspiracy that could bring down some very dangerous people. And those people knew he was alive. The question was, how long did they have before the hunters became the hunted? The third day in Tombstone dawned with an ominous stillness. Even the usual morning sounds, roosters crowing, dogs barking, the clip-clop of horses, seemed muted, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Eli had barely slept. Every creak of the boarding house, every footstep in the hallway had him reaching for his Colt. Jacob had spent the night curled up in a chair by the window, refusing to sleep in the bed where he felt trapped. Mr. Eli, Jacob whispered as the first rays of sunlight crept through the curtains. I think they know. What makes you say that, son? Look outside. Eli peered through the curtains and felt his blood run cold. Across the street, 2 men lounged against the general store, their eyes fixed on the boarding house. Down the street, another man sat on a bench, whittling a piece of wood but never looking down at his hands. And at the corner, Hank Drury himself stood talking to a shopkeeper, but his attention was clearly elsewhere. They're watching us, Jacob said, his voice barely audible. I see them! Eli's mind raced. They needed to get to those documents, but they also needed to get out of this trap. Jacob, I need you to listen very carefully. We're going to have to move fast today. A soft knock at the door made them both freeze. Mr. Mercer? It was Martha's voice, but there was something different about it. A tension that hadn't been there before. Eli motioned for Jacob to stay back as he approached the door. Yes, ma'am? Could I speak with you downstairs? Privately? Eli exchanged glances with Jacob. I'll be right down. Martha was waiting in the kitchen, wringing her hands nervously. Her usually warm demeanor was replaced by obvious fear. Mrs. Bell, what's wrong? They came to see me last night, she whispered. After you went upstairs. Sheriff Mallory and that Drury fellow. What did they want? They asked about you and the boy. Wanted to know how long you'd been here, where you came from, what you'd said. Martha's eyes filled with tears. Mr. Mercer, I've lived in this town for 15 years. I've seen good people disappear, seen families pack up and leave in the middle of the night. I know what happens to folks who cross certain people. What did you tell them? Nothing. I told them nothing. But they know, Mr. Mercer. They know that boy isn't your nephew. Eli felt the walls closing in. Mrs. Bell, I need you to understand something. That boy upstairs, his life depends on getting him out of this town safely. I know who he is, Martha said quietly. I knew the moment I saw him. He has his mother's eyes. Sarah Turner was my friend. Her voice broke. Those monsters killed her whole family, didn't they? Eli nodded grimly. Then you listen to me, Martha said, her fear transforming into fierce determination. There's a back way out of this building. Through the kitchen, out to the alley. My horse is in the stable behind the church. Take it. Mrs. Bell, I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering. That little boy deserves justice for his family. They'll know you helped us. Martha straightened her shoulders. Let them come. I've been afraid too long. 20 minutes later, Eli and Jacob slipped out the back door of the boarding house. The alley was empty, but Eli could hear voices from the street. Men coordinating, planning. They were running out of time. The stable behind the church was exactly where Martha had said it would be. Her horse, a sturdy bay mare, was already saddled and ready. As they prepared to mount, Reverend Hayes appeared in the doorway. Going somewhere, gentlemen? Eli's hand moved to his gun, but the Reverend raised his hands peacefully. I'm not here to stop you, he said quietly. Martha sent me. She thought you might need this. He handed Eli a folded piece of paper. It's a map. Shows the old church ruins and the safest way to get there without being seen. Why are you helping us? Because I've been a coward too long. I've watched this town rot from the inside, watched good people suffer, and I've done nothing. Maybe it's time I remembered what my calling really means. The old church ruins lay 3 miles east of town, hidden in a grove of cottonwood trees. The building had been destroyed in a fire years ago, leaving only the stone foundation and a few charred timbers. But beneath the rubble, according to Jacob's memory of his father's instructions, lay the evidence that could bring down the conspiracy. They reached the ruins without incident, but Eli knew their pursuers wouldn't be far behind. While Jacob searched for the specific stone his father had described, Eli kept watch. Here, Jacob called out. This is it. The boy was kneeling beside a large foundation stone that looked identical to all the others, but when Eli examined it closely, he could see it had been carefully loosened. Together, they pried it up, revealing a metal box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside the box were dozens of documents, deeds, contracts, correspondence, and sworn statements. As Eli read through them, the scope of the conspiracy became clear. It wasn't just about land fraud or cattle rustling. It was about the systematic murder and displacement of homesteaders to cover up illegal mining operations that reached all the way to the territorial capital. My God, Eli breathed. Jacob, your father uncovered something huge. Will it be enough to stop them? More than enough. But first we have to get these to someone who can... The sound of approaching horses cut him off. Through the trees, Eli could see riders, at least 6 of them, led by Sheriff Mallory and Hank Drury. They found us, Jacob whispered. Eli quickly stuffed the documents back into the box and handed it to Jacob. Listen to me, son. I want you to take these and run. Follow the creek bed north until you reach the main road, then head for Tucson. Find the territorial marshal and give him these papers. What about you? I'm going to buy you some time. No. Jacob's eyes filled with tears. I won't leave you. You have to. This is bigger than just us now. Your family died for these documents. Don't let their sacrifice be for nothing. The riders were getting closer. Eli could hear Mallory's voice calling out, We know you're in there, Mercer. Send out the boy and we'll make this quick. Go, Eli urged. Now. Jacob hesitated for one more moment, then threw his arms around Eli's waist. Thank you, he whispered, for believing me, for caring. Go be brave, son. Make your family proud. Jacob disappeared into the underbrush just as the riders emerged into the clearing. Eli stepped out from behind the ruins, his hands visible but ready to draw. Sheriff Mallory, he said calmly. Fancy meeting you here? Where's the boy, Mercer? What boy? Hank Drury spurred his horse forward, his gun already drawn. Don't play games with us. We know he's here. You boys seem mighty interested in one little kid. Makes a man wonder what you're so afraid of. We're not afraid of anything, Mallory said, but there was sweat on his forehead despite the cool morning air. We're just trying to protect the town from dangerous criminals." "Criminals?" Eli laughed. "You mean like the ones who murdered the Turner family? The ones who've been stealing land and killing innocent people for years?" The sheriff's mask finally slipped. "You don't know what you're talking about. I know enough. I know about the mining operation. I know about the forged deeds. I know about the territorial officials you've been paying off." "You know nothing!" Drury snarled. "And in about 2 minutes, you'll know even less." But as the outlaws prepared to close in, the sound of more horses filled the air. From the north came a group of riders flying the territorial marshal's flag. From the south, a posse of townspeople led by Martha Bell and Reverend Hayes. "Looks like your secret's out, boys," Eli said with grim satisfaction. The next few minutes were chaos. Gunfire erupted as Drury and his men tried to fight their way out, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. When the smoke cleared, Drury lay dead, and Mallory was wounded and captured. As the territorial marshal took charge of the scene, Jacob emerged from his hiding place, still clutching the box of documents. He ran to Eli, who swept him up in a fierce hug. "You did it, son. You got them." "We did it," Jacob corrected. "We got them together." But even as justice began to unfold, Eli knew their story was far from over. The documents Jacob carried would expose a conspiracy that reached far beyond Tombstone, and there would be powerful people who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. The real battle was just beginning. 2 weeks had passed since the confrontation at the old church ruins, and Tombstone was a town transformed. The territorial marshal, James Crawford, had arrived with a full investigation team, and the scope of the conspiracy had shocked even the most cynical observers. Eli sat on the porch of Martha's boarding house, watching Jacob play with a wooden horse that Reverend Hayes had carved for him. The boy still woke up with nightmares sometimes, but the haunted look in his eyes was slowly being replaced by something Eli hadn't seen since that first night in the cave: hope. "Penny for your thoughts," Martha said, settling into the chair beside him with 2 cups of coffee. "Just thinking about how much can change in a few weeks." "Indeed it can." Martha smiled. "That boy's been asking about you all morning. Wants to know if you're really leaving today." Eli sighed. The territorial marshal had offered him a job as a deputy, tracking down the remaining members of the conspiracy. It was good work, important work, but it meant leaving Tombstone, leaving Jacob. "Mr. Eli!" Jacob came running up the porch steps, his face bright with excitement. "Marshal Crawford says they found more evidence in the mine. He says the bad men are going to prison for a real long time." "That's wonderful news, son." Jacob's expression grew serious. "He also said you're leaving." "I have work to do, Jacob. There are other bad men out there, in other towns. People who need help. But what about me?" The question hit Eli like a physical blow. Over the past 2 weeks, he'd grown more attached to the boy than he'd ever thought possible. Jacob had filled a hole in his heart that he hadn't even known existed. "Well," Martha said carefully, "I've been thinking about that. This old boarding house gets mighty lonely sometimes. I could use some help around here. Someone to tend the garden, help with the guests, maybe learn to read and write properly." Jacob's eyes widened. "You mean I could stay here? With you? If you'd like, and if Mr. Eli thinks it's a good idea." Eli looked at the hope shining in Jacob's eyes and felt his throat tighten. "I think it's a wonderful idea, son. Mrs. Bell is good people. She'll take care of you. But I want to come with you," Jacob said, his voice small. "I want to help catch the bad men." "Jacob," Eli knelt down to the boy's level, "you've already done more to catch the bad men than most grown folks ever do. You were brave when you needed to be brave, and you never gave up. Your family would be so proud of you. Will I see you again? I promise you will. And I'll write letters, tell you about all the places I go and the people I meet." That afternoon, the whole town gathered in the square for a ceremony. Marshal Crawford stood before the crowd, holding the box of documents that had started it all. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "today we close a dark chapter in the history of this territory. Thanks to the courage of one young boy and the determination of a good man who refused to look the other way, a conspiracy that reached from this town to the territorial capital has been exposed. The crowd erupted in cheers. Eli watched from the back, uncomfortable with the attention but proud of what they'd accomplished. The Turner family, Crawford continued, died protecting evidence that will ensure justice for dozens of other families who suffered at the hands of these criminals. Their sacrifice will not be forgotten. After the ceremony, as the crowd began to disperse, a familiar figure approached Eli. It was Pete, the bartender from the Silver Dollar Saloon. "Heard you're moving on," Pete said. "That's right. Wanted to thank you for what you did. This town's been living in fear for too long. Just did what needed doing." Pete smiled. "You know, there's talk of making you an honorary citizen of Tombstone, maybe even naming a street after you." Eli chuckled. "I'd prefer they didn't. I like my privacy." "I figured as much. But there's something else." Pete's expression grew serious. "Words come in from other towns. Seems this conspiracy had tentacles reaching further than anyone thought. There's going to be a lot of work cleaning it up." "I know. That's why I have to go. Just be careful out there. These people, they don't give up easy." As evening approached, Eli prepared for his departure. He'd packed light, as always. Just his bedroll, some supplies, and the few personal items he carried. But saying goodbye to Jacob proved harder than he'd expected. The boy stood in the doorway of the boarding house, trying to be brave but failing to hide his tears. "I'm going to miss you," Jacob said. "I'm going to miss you too, son. More than you know. Will you really write?" "Every chance I get. And I want you to write back. Tell me how you're doing in school, how you're helping Mrs. Bell." Jacob nodded, then suddenly threw his arms around Eli's waist. "Thank you," he whispered, "for saving me, for believing in me." Eli hugged him back, fighting his own tears. "You saved yourself, Jacob. I just helped a little." As Eli mounted Dusty and prepared to ride out of town, Martha appeared beside Jacob. "You're always welcome here," she called out. "This will always be your home, too." Eli touched his hat in acknowledgement, then looked down at Jacob one more time. "Remember what I told you, son. Be brave, be kind, and never stop fighting for what's right." "I will," Jacob promised. "I'll make you proud. You already have." As Eli rode west toward the setting sun, he could hear Jacob calling after him. "I love you, Mr. Eli." The words followed him long after Tombstone had disappeared behind the hills. 3 months later, Eli sat in a hotel room in Phoenix, reading a letter that had been forwarded to him through the marshal's office. It was written in careful, childish handwriting. "Dear Mr. Eli, I hope this letter finds you well. Mrs. Bell is teaching me to write better, so I hope you can read this okay. Things are good here in Tombstone. The new sheriff is a nice man named Deputy Wilson. He used to work for Marshal Crawford. Mrs. Bell says he's honest as the day is long. I'm doing good in school. The teacher says I'm real smart and that I should think about going to college someday. Mrs. Bell says maybe I could be a lawyer and help people like you helped me. I still have bad dreams sometimes, but not as much. Mrs. Bell says that's normal and that they'll get better with time. She's been like a real mother to me. Reverend Hayes has been teaching me to carve wood. I made you something. Mrs. Bell says she'll send it with the next letter. I heard from Marshal Crawford that you caught 3 more bad men in Prescott. I'm proud of you for helping more people. I miss you every day, but I'm happy here. Mrs. Bell is good to me, and the people in town treat me like family. They call me the boy who saved Tombstone sometimes, but I tell them it was really you who saved me. Please be safe out there, and please come visit soon. Love, Jacob Turner P.S. Mrs. Bell says to tell you that your room is always ready if you want to come home." Eli folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket, next to his heart. Home. It had been a long time since anywhere had felt like home. Outside his window, the Arizona desert stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars. Somewhere out there, more bad men were hurting innocent people, more children were in danger, more families needed justice. But for the first time in years, Eli Mercer didn't feel alone in the fight. He had something worth fighting for now, Not just justice, but the promise he'd made to a brave little boy who'd taught him that even the loneliest cowboy could find family in the most unexpected places. As he prepared for sleep, Eli made a decision. After he finished his current assignment, after he'd helped the marshal clean up the last of the conspiracy, he would return to Tombstone. He would keep his promise to Jacob. Because sometimes the greatest adventure isn't riding off into the sunset alone, it's finding the courage to come home. In the distance, a coyote howled at the moon, and Eli smiled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new opportunities to make a difference. But tonight, he would dream of a little boy with sandy hair and brave eyes, and a town called Tombstone, where a lonely cowboy had finally found his purpose. The story of Eli Mercer and Jacob Turner had begun with a cry in the darkness and a child's desperate flight from evil. It had ended with justice served, a family avenged, and two lost souls finding each other in the vast wilderness of the American West. And in the years to come, when people told the story of the lonely cowboy who found a lost boy in a bear cave, they would always end it the same way, with the reminder that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who choose to care, when they could just as easily ride away. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.